I'm going to make a start now to our team, our internal team. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those in Uzbekistan and good evening as well. Welcome to day 2 of the British Council's Uzbekistan English Language Assessment Conference. This event offers perspectives on language policy and language assessment in Uzbekistan. And it forms part of a series of conferences that are related to the British Council's highly successful regional conferences called New Directions in English Language Assessment that we currently hold on an annual basis in East Asia and in Latin America. So thank you to everyone in Uzbekistan and abroad for coming to the second day of our 3-day event. My name is Victoria Clark from the British Council, and I will be your moderator for this conference along with some of my colleagues. In a minute, I will pass you to my colleague, Keshav Sridharan, who will give a quick recap. But before, I'd like to have a few words around some housekeeping. Number 1, could you please make sure your microphones are muted so that we don't have any noise disturbance during any sessions? And secondly, if you have any questions for any of our panelists or our plenary speakers, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that you have a Q&A function and a chat function. The Q&A function is to provide questions and comments that I will then send and give to our speakers. And the chat function is where you can interact with your fellow attendees. So now I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Keshav Sridharan, who is the British Council's Regional Exams Director for wider Europe. He will give a short recap of day 1 of the conference, which was held yesterday. And I'll pass it over to you, Keshav.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria. What a scintillating day 1 it has been. A very good afternoon to all participants in Uzbekistan, and good morning or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're currently logging in from. We started with Professor Barry O'Sullivan from the British Council set the tone for the conference in terms of describing neatly the comprehensive learning system with the triangle, which talks about curriculum, delivery and assessment, and the importance of aligning all these elements where standards underpin everything. There was a nice Q&A session for Professor Barry where we talked about the importance of a communication plan so that diverse stakeholders need to be aligned in order to ensure the success of this program. A presentation by Professor Barry is usually a hard act to follow, but Professor Anthony Green really stepped up and in terms of the presentation that he delivered on the washback effect of assessments, still stays in my memory. He started with the rationale on why people need to learn English, but more importantly, he also talked about another diagram that kind of is etched on my mind about how you have test items which sometimes tend to overlap with real language tasks, and how you would need tests that has test items which actually represent what people do outside the classroom when they use their English. After Professor Barry O'Sullivan and Professor Anthony Green, we had Yaira Abdurayomova from Uzbekistan talking about the history of preset reform initiatives and assessments. She spoke about the improvement of curriculum of preset. She gave a lot of examples around assessment tasks and demand to change the curriculum, and also looked at live case studies, really stressing upon the need for assessment literacy for teachers. After 3 sessions, we moved on to a very engaging and an interactive panel discussion involving Yaira, Ralph Rogers from British Council in Taiwan, Svetlana, and Sardar Rajabov from Uzbekistan. Obviously, a panel as diverse as this, had enough knowledge to share in terms of the need for data to make future policy decisions, particularly around the Taiwan example around how they benchmarked, large volumes of candidates in order to arrive at policy decisions. We also spoke about the ambitious plan of the state testing center's evolution and its current work around how they plan to go digital and use AI in order to improve test security. Svetlana shared her experience on teacher training and language assessments, and obviously there were kind of strong inputs on teachers who are working on the language in order to develop their assessment skills. So I was very impressed by the levels of engagement on the Q&A chat box and the insightful questions that participants had asked. So much so that for the entire duration of the conference, I couldn't lift my headset off my ears. It was quite engaging to see, some of the responses to those question answers. And a very diverse group of participants across, not just from Tashkent, from places as Kashi, Samarkand, Urgench, Fergana. I'm based in Istanbul, and obviously I joined this team in the middle of the pandemic. So, given the first opportunity, I would definitely love to visit all these places and hoping to meet you all in person. But overall, fantastic day one with good inputs from all participants and very active engagements. And I do hope that we continue the same momentum in day two as well. So without taking too much time, I hand over to Professor Christine Kuhn. Over to you.
I'll just introduce Christine. So, okay, first question. Thank you very much. And now, everyone, we're going to hear our first plenary session for today by Dr. Christine Kuhn. And she'll be speaking about the importance of language assessment literacy in teacher training. Dr. Christine Kuhn has a PhD in foreign and second language education from the Ohio State University and is Associate Professor of General Studies at Dubai's Men's College, Higher Colleges of Technology in the UAE. Christine has co-authored and edited 54 volumes on testing and assessment, research, teacher effectiveness, leadership, and task-based learning and teaching. Dr. Kuhn has previously served as TESOL International Association President and as a member of the Board of Directors. So once again, before I hand over to Dr. Christine Kuhn, please remember to put your comments in the Q&A function as well as your questions. And now over to you, Dr. Christine Kuhn. I'll just wait so make sure you'll share, you can share your slides.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Welcome. Don't know what time of the day is. For me, it's the afternoon. I've got a 1 hour thing between teaching. So let's get started on one of my favorite topics, and that's the importance of language assessment literacy for teachers, teacher trainers.
Okay. We can see your screen, no problem.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my on slideshow. Okay, here we go. Hopefully that's going to work. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to talk about to you with the brief time I have together is basically we're going to look at some definitions of what is assessment literacy, some of the barriers or the reasons that teachers lack assessment literacy. We'll question ourselves, is it really necessary? We'll look at and just a preview, yes, of course it is. We'll look at the rationale for why teachers need to be assessment literate. And then we'll turn our attention to some of the professional development strategies that we can use if we want to develop our assessment literacy. And we'll finish off with some worldwide assessment literacy projects. So I'm going to start out with a definition from Stiggins, who is not in language assessment. He is in regular assessment. And way back in 1995, he used the term assessment literacy. And he basically said, if you want to be a teacher that is assessment literate, you need to know what to assess, why you're assessing it, how to assess it, what the possible problems with the assessment would be, and how to prevent those problems from occurring even in advance of the assessment. And finally, they need to be familiar with the possible negative consequences of poor assessment. Well, the what and why and how are usually what people consider to be assessment literate, but you can see that there are a lot more things that we need to be taken into consideration. Now let's move forward a couple of decades and let's have a look at a definition that might be more familiar to you, and that's Glenn Fulcher's definition of a three-aspect model of assessment literacy. Now, a disclaimer first is that there are so many great definitions in the knowledge base about assessment literacy, but I've chosen Glenn Fulcher's because it really resonates with me and kind of guided my assessment literacy endeavors over the years. So Glenn basically puts forward that the three aspects of assessment literacy are knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we need to have knowledge, skills, and abilities in a variety of different topics like design, development, maintain, evaluate, not only the classroom tests that we administer, but also those large-scale standardized tests. We also have to have familiarity with the test processes and awareness of the guiding principles, such as ethics and codes of practices or cornerstones of assessment. Glenn's third concept is having the ability to place the knowledge, skills, principles within the wider historical, political, and philosophical frameworks, and to even go further to impact, to see what impact this all has on the wider community and the assessment profession as a whole. Now, a more simplistic definition is the one I have put forward here. So I also consider there to be three aspects of assessment literacy, amongst others. What do I know and understand about assessment and testing? What do I do with what I know and understand about assessment and testing? And what do I do to improve what I do with what I know and understand about language testing and assessment? So let's move now to some barriers of why people lack assessment literacy skills. Well, Stiggins came forward in 1995 with a really serious one, I think. According to him, teachers often have a layer of negative emotions associated with assessment. So in my face-to-face workshops, and I wish there was a way that I could see face-to-face, I often started with having teachers in my workshops talk about, when I say, think about a past assessment or testing experience. And I'd give them a minute or so to think about it. And then I'd say, was the thing you thought about negative or positive? And more often than not, at least 10 years ago, people in the audience, teachers mostly, would come up with a negative association with testing and assessment. But now I feel with the increase in assessment literacy in teachers' lives, they are now coming forward with more positive layers of emotion associated with assessment. Another barrier is that some of the assessment concepts that we often hear about or have to use are very complex, and they have their own jargon, their own concepts, their own language, and testing involves mathematics in the form of statistics and other numerical machinations that we must do. And you know, we're English teachers for a reason. Maybe we are not so good at mathematics, but maybe mathematics is kind of difficult for us to grasp. Some teachers may go as far as to fear assessment. Now, one of the things I noticed in my own institution, a few years ago, we had a testing supervisor who, after the test, would have meetings so that we could discuss things that were on the tests. And often teachers would complain about various assessments or assessment items. And I noticed that this assessment supervisor, when this happened, he wasn't in the classroom, so he didn't really know how to address those questions and criticisms. So what he did was he launched into a discussion about high-level statistical terminology. And really, I saw it turn the teachers around, because he started talking over their heads with things they didn't understand, and it worked. The questions and the complaints stopped, and you know, he evolved in this situation by just throwing in some terms, difficult concepts to understand for most teachers. Now, another barrier is that the average classroom teacher might not have the ability to easily understand journal articles about language testing and assessment. Yes, another slide of barriers. Until I would say the last decade, most of the time to have a class on assessment was not part of many teacher training courses. I remember a statistics maybe about 10 years ago that only 10% of all MA courses in the US had a separate course for language assessment. And remembering back to my master's degree, which of course was way more than 10 years ago, I think the only language testing I had was a chapter in a methodology textbook. I know the field has come a lot further than that these days, but some master's programs don't have testing as part of their curriculum. So teachers lack both theoretical knowledge that they would have gotten from coursework and the practical experience that they need to get started. Other scenarios, teachers don't even need to write tests because their tests come from somewhere else. Maybe they have a testing team, maybe they have a testing unit, maybe they come from the ministry and they're written by others. Maybe they buy tests that are written for them, or maybe their tests come from textbook packages that they are using in their programs. So our teachers really are only responsible for these small scale, low stakes classroom tests or quizzes. Now, I know you can all relate because I too am a practicing teacher, and this one is really an issue for me as well. These days, especially, I guess we're still in COVID, but definitely at the beginning of COVID, we have increasing workplace demands because now we're handling groups of students. At my institution, we've got some that are studying online and some that are with us face-to-face. So lots more admin, administrivia, etc. So with these increasing workplace demands, they have no time really to write tests. So it's easier to just let others do it. And of course, insufficient resources are allocated. Administrators don't see, they don't understand the process and how long and how time consuming it is to write tests. So they don't allocate anything like a course buyout or download or any extra salary or kind of benefits. And what often happens when teachers get involved in this kind of activity, they realize how long it takes and how much work they put into it, and they realize they get nothing for doing that. So oftentimes they just say, I did it once, I don't want to do it again. Let's move forward with some teacher views on assessment. And I think these contribute to some assessment literacy issues and challenges. Well, it is largely recognized that assessment literacy is a critical topic. Teachers buy into that, but they often feel they're not assessment literate and they don't want, and they're too almost embarrassed to admit it. Some feel far removed from the testing process. And many times teachers feel that tests are the only way we can motivate our students. I know that's something that is existing in my context as well. Students are tired, are kind of slowing down, but now we have all these tests coming up, so I see a little bit more action on the part of my students, particularly those that are studying online. Teachers also view a gap to exist between teaching and testing. And they feel that if testers are writing the tests at their institutions, testers, especially those that are not in the classroom, they feel that they are not in touch with the realities of the classroom. And strangely enough, oftentimes many teachers see testing and assessment as the least fun aspect of their jobs, which is, of course, for me, unbelievable because I love testing, as do, I'm sure, many of you here in this session. So is assessment literacy necessary? Well, I've already answered that question. Okay, research has shown that a typical teacher spends as much as a third of their professional time either engaged in testing and assessment or assessment related activities. So with this amount of time alone, of course, it's essential that English language teachers have a solid grounding in language testing theory, but also those practical test writing skills. They need to be able to write tests that assess their students accurately and fairly, and they also need to evaluate and critique the tests of others that they might use in their classrooms. One pretty much says it all as well, and provides an excellent rationale for assessment literacy. By the time we graduate, we've taken thousands of tests, but have only actually written 2 or 3. So I think that's a perfect rationale for the need for teacher trainees to learn about assessment literacy. And I feel personally that involvement in assessment is every teacher's responsibility, whether they want to be involved in it or not. And I think minimal involvement means that teachers understand what the purpose of the test is, what the nature or type of test is, and the philosophy behind it. Ideal involvement is all of the above, everything that's in minimal, plus participation in test construction and development, piloting of that test, and reporting on the results. So what skills do we really need? What skills do teachers and of course teacher trainees need? Well, I like this list that is put forward by Brindley way back in 2000, who says for a valid and reliable test, teachers need a wide range of skills. They need to be able to observe, interpret, and document the language use of their students. They also need to be able to design the classroom tests as well as assessment tasks. They need to be able to analyze those results, provide diagnostic and constructive, and I would say formative feedback to their students. And of course, they need to evaluate the quality of tests and tasks, not only the ones they write, but the ones they use from other sources. So to get us in on the topic of professional development or in-service or pre-service development, let's look now to 4 models of in-house test development. So usually institutions use one of these 4, and they are teachers write the tests, testers write the test, administration buys the test, or my personal favorite, teachers and testers write the test collaboratively and together. So let's take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these models, and then move into some of the activities we can use to help us develop our assessment literacy skills. Now, model 1 is where teachers write the test, and it has just as many advantages and disadvantages. First up, this model is good because it's seen to reduce the gap between teaching and testing, okay? Also, because teachers are writing the test, they feel ownership and buy-in for the test. And administration like this model because it's saving money. Teachers are doing it and they don't have to pay for anybody else too. Now, the disadvantage, however, is that these tests are rarely reliable because the teachers, of course, lack training and expertise in test writing and development. Now, this leads to lots of mistakes in the test being made, so it leads to a one-time use of the test, which, of course, is a waste of valuable resources. Moving on to model 2, where testing specialists or testers write the test. Of course, because testers are doing it, it's increased reliability in the test. Because specialists are involved, statistics are generated, etc. Teachers like it because their workload is decreased. They also like it because they're removed from the responsibility of doing it. Okay, now what are the disadvantages? Well, there's that much cited gap between teaching and learning and testing that exists. Also, teachers sometimes feel alienated and left out of the process. But most importantly, in terms of this disadvantage, teachers don't have the opportunity to learn to develop tests and to gain assessment literacy. So in my view, a major disadvantage. Now, with model 3, where your administration buys the test, the advantages are high status and reliability if the test they buy is internationally recognized, like IELTS, like APTIS, like TOEFL, okay? It also saves time. And usually because of the high reliability and internationally recognized instruments that are bought, there's usually no argument on the part of students or teachers about the results. Now, on the negative side, there's a potential mismatch between teaching and testing. These are also very costly. The expense of using these types of tests are bad. And of course, teachers don't have the opportunity to improve their assessment literacy, a major disadvantage in my view. Now, my personal favorite model is Model 4, where teachers and testers write the test together. So you've got, on the one hand, the testers share their expertise of the test development and validation process with teachers, but teachers also share their classroom insights with testers. Sounds like a win-win, doesn't it? So it results in greater buy-in from teachers, and it reduces that teaching and testing gap. And by administrators, it's seen to be an efficient use of resources. Now, what are the disadvantages? Well, long lead time, basically, because as we all know, you know, you can't, like every semester, I'm in charge of writing some tests for the subjects I teach. So week 1, I say to the rest of the teachers, let's work together. I need some questions for the midterm by next week. And then they say to me, well, but the midterm is in week 10. This is only week 1. Now that goes on for a few more weeks until 2 weeks before the midterm, teachers realize that they need to get working, and they throw together oftentimes not so good sampling of questions to use. So that's never a good thing. Another disadvantage here, you need administrative commitment for this thing to work. You might need to allocate resources like course release or course buyout, or some training, or even a stipend for the work. So why should we involve teachers? Well, because assessment and feedback are central to teaching, who knows best about what's happening in the classroom? Teachers are needed to participate in the program so that the tests they utilize are reflective of the curriculum and applicable to the levels of our students. Tests also have to be close to the curriculum and to the teaching, because if there's no correspondence, the test does not reflect best practice. So teaching should also be close to tests, because if that occurs, then teachers are always engaged in good teaching practice, whether it be related to tests or not. Let's move on now to models of professional development in language assessment. Well, lots of professional groups, government entities, and practitioners all recognize how important assessment literacy is for teachers. NCATE and TESOL have prioritized assessment as one of the 5 professional knowledge domains. Similarly, the 21 member countries of the Asia Pacific Economic Consortium acknowledge that assessment for English language teachers is central. And the SEFR and the European Portfolio for Modern Languages recommend exploring new assessment avenues. So everybody does it. So now I'm happy to report that 10 years ago, there wasn't such a discussion on assessment literacy. But now when I looked on you know, in the journals and databases, so many people are researching assessment literacy and doing lots of things with it. So let's turn now to the last part of my presentation, which will share some ways to increase teacher assessment literacy. First up, I think if you really want to improve your knowledge and skills, and you want to work in the area of language assessment, maybe looking for master's and PhD programs on the topic is the way to go. However, one-off training courses that are, you know, low cost or of very good quality are out there as well if you want to take a more gradual approach. Upskilling through reading, books, publications, journals, I'll talk about those in a few minutes. Activities that are organized by professional associations, yet another. And I'll tell you how I and a colleague, Peter Davidson, formed lots of assessment literacy events through the TESOL Arabia Testing and Assessment SIG. Then we'll look at some people approaches, web-based approaches, and then finally we'll finish off with some worldwide assessment literacy projects, which many of you might already be familiar with. So, publications. There are lots of different types of publications. Reference books, textbooks, many open access publications, journals, encyclopedia, the assessment glossary from the British Council, and a new test directory from ELTS, or ELT Society. Some of my go-to publications that I'd like to share with you. The first one, the Cambridge Language Assessment Series, which started in 2000, and I still think that they are publishing books. Last I looked, there were 35 or 39 volumes, but I'm not sure if the series is continues, but they have volumes that are pretty much on every topic within assessment. I'd like to also put in a plug for my own, which I think is one of my, well, if I could say greatest contributions to the testing and assessment literacy professional knowledge base, which is volume 8 of the TESOL Wiley Encyclopedia of ELT. I edit the assessment and evaluation volume, and it came out in 2018 with 77 chapters or entries on virtually every aspect of testing, assessment, and evaluation. And, you know, I'm very proud of that publication because some of the authors in there are world famous in the field, but also we have a mixture of the very famous and the very well-written, as well as the up-and-comers, including 5 members of the assessment and evaluation team at the British Council. Now, I talked a little bit about the A to Z of Second Language Assessment Glossary, which is part of the British Council's Assessment Literacy Project. I also was involved in that, and that includes, I don't know, about 300 terms within the testing field that were written by teachers in the field from many different countries. And their purview or their mandate was to write definitions of testing terms that were accessible to teachers who were new to the field. So I encourage you to have a look at that as well. As you may or may not know, there are 2 major journals in our field, Language Testing and Language Assessment Quarterly, as well as other journals out there who are doing special issues on assessment topics. Here's one in my part of the world. The Arab Journal of Applied Linguistics put out a special issue on assessment. So those things are popping up all over the place as well. Now, professional associations, of which I have been very well involved in, also have lots of things on their list of activities. I've just provided a few of the professional associations that, and I'm sorry if I've forgotten one, but the slide was only so big. So there's lots of, there's lots of international, regional, and you might even have or want to start a professional association that has an interest section or a special interest group on assessment. My own TESOL Arabia testing and assessment initiatives were things like one-off training courses. Our signature course was the FLA, or Fundamentals of Language Assessment course. We presentations at regional conferences to publicize things. Our CTELT conference ran for 16 years, and CTELT stands for Current Trends in English Language Testing. We put out many assessment publications, online certificate courses, as well as self-access materials. Our one-off training courses, the FLA that I just told you about, was either 1 to 2 days or 1 to 2 week courses for teachers. We did those in 34 countries around the world. And the main focus, of course, was on the fundamentals of language assessment. And we mixed knowledge of theory and practice with more practical content. Now let's move to a team approach. Again, the idea of peer mentoring, I feel, is a good one. The creation of work groups where people either work on tests together, or they work on things like rubrics, or they work on knowledge. Getting ongoing feedback during the process is a critical need for teachers, and that could be done in a group, face-to-face, or a virtual environment. I think professional development through personal connections is another great strategy. My own new dream is the creation of an assessment book club. Now, I don't know if you all know what a book club is, but in my country and in many others, book clubs are kind of like social events. And, you know, you have a few members, and each month one member chooses a book and everybody in the group reads that book. They go to each other's houses or on Zoom, and they talk about some of the major themes of that book. Now, I've never joined a real book club because oftentimes the books are not books I want to read that other people choose. But with an interest in assessment, wouldn't it be cool to have an assessment book club or article? You know, we don't have to read a whole book. It could be an article club, and form discussion groups either in a face-to-face situation or online. Some of the web-based resources are very, very nice. We've got Glenn Fulcher's Resources in Language Testing website, the British Council's Assessment Literacy Project, which includes a series of 12 animated videos on top, you know, short animated videos on really important assessment literacy topics, the glossary I was telling you about, and a Mooc. Now, I wish I had the time to look up. I think the third version of the Mooc is currently in progress, but I'm not sure. Maybe somebody from the BC could put that in the chat. But that's, I think it lasts about 3 months, and I sat in on it the first time around, and it's a really, really interesting course. Finally, the Language Testing Research Group has lots of resources on their website, and I encourage you to check them out. Now, let's look at a few worldwide assessment literacy projects. We've got the ELT, English Language Teaching Professional, which has an introduction to assessment literacy. Again, series of videos as well as some training. The TAIL, Teachers Assessment Literacy Enhancement, also has some valuable resources, which I advise you to check out. The Assessment Literacy Workshops of WestEd, with a focus on K-12 educators, although that's based in the US, but for those of you who teach secondary school, that might be good. SCALE, which is Stanford Center for Assessment Learning and Equity, has a building educator assessment literacy program, which gets very good reviews. English Language Testing Society has, with membership, you get a little assessment literacy certificate of 4 sessions, as well as a conference annually. And last but not least, to our beloved British Council, who have an excellent How Language Assessment Works site, which I described earlier here. So really, if you've got a free afternoon, take advantage of, you know, Googling some of the many resources that are on offer. And if you have others that I haven't included in this presentation, I would appreciate an email. If you want a copy of this presentation, send me an email. If you've got another idea of something that I've missed here, send it to me and I'll add it to my list of resources. So I think I've finished 2 minutes in advance by some miracle. So the lights have turned out, so I'm going to go. It's wait.
You've put yourself on mute, Christine. We'll just wait for Christine to return. And okay, just check that's okay. Okay, Christine?
Yep.
Lovely, lovely. Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. And I think by asking everyone to email you for your slides, I think you're going to get about 361 emails in the next couple of days.
Good, that's good.
And thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And it's certainly given us a lot of questions to put to you in the next 15 minutes. So if I may, jump straight in. An interesting question is, during your presentation, you mentioned the types of skills and knowledge that we need in order to be assessment literate. Now, one of the questions we have is, based on all these skills and knowledge that you mentioned, what are the key areas that you feel need to be addressed in preset education?
Well, again, what I call the cornerstones of assessment are so important, and the guidelines of assessment literacy, like usefulness, like validity, reliability, practicality, authenticity, washback, transparency, and security. Those I feel are, especially if you're in, well, I guess secondary school and higher education. So having an understanding of the basic principles that underlie good testing practice is a logical first step, quite frankly. Types of tests, knowing what you're using. You remember the slide about minimal knowledge, and that was test purpose, why you're testing, etc. Plus, then getting involved in ideal involvement, which would be developing tests, item writing, piloting, and then reporting on and analyzing would be ideal.
Okay.
No.
Thank you very much. And I think a very current question has come up around the concerns around online assessment. We talk about assessment literacy, writing tests, designing valid and reliable quality assessments for the classroom. What is your view on online assessment? And someone asked, how reliable do you feel they are? An easy question for you, Christy.
It is an easy. In fact, I'm working on a presentation on mitigating against cheating in online assessments, because, and we now can see the differences in like the course I teach. You know, if the online assessment is given at the beginning of the week, the grades are, you know, the normal curve. But if the students take it on Thursday, the last day of the week, like everybody's getting 100, even with an item bank. So, you know, the thing that is problematic to me is the cheating element. It's really like the worst thing I think that's evolved. It's like knowing to what extent at least students are using these kinds of opportunities rather than, you know. But what can you do if you're using online assessments? There are very few programs where you can do, let's say, where the questions aren't objective, okay? Because that's what institutions are looking at. So unless you use some questions that students have to, you know, some subjective types of short answer questions or essays, then it might even out or balance out. But yeah, it's a real issue. So much so that I'll be glad to get back into the classroom. I think online teaching and learning has its place, but we're calling all students back for face-to-face assessments now.
Okay, thank you very much. And an interesting one for you, a question. What do you think is the most interesting research that is happening at the moment with teacher assessment literacy?
Oh, wow, that's such a good question. You know, there are, there's general assessment literacy, and now I've been discovering that they're looking at assessment literacy within each of the skill areas. So I think, you know, honing out what, in fact, I just saw an article or a book on writing assessment literacy by Deborah Cruzan just came out. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be good to take the assessment literacy processes and see how they fit within the individual skill areas. I see that as interesting because I'm a classroom teacher. That might not be interesting to someone who's really research based and wants to look outside of the classroom.
Absolutely. Another interesting question. You mentioned in your presentation that one option would be to buy an outside test developed by testing professionals. And the question here is, if a test is bought from a test developer, is it their responsibility to make sure the teacher understands the test purpose and the nature of the test, or whose responsibility is it? I think the question here is around fitness for purpose. By buying an off-the-shelf, whose responsibility is that?
Well, I personally feel it should be both, but I feel if a teacher is assessment literate, they're going to be a good consumer of a test. So it's their responsibility, pretty much. They're not their sole responsibility, but I think that when you're in negotiations with a testing body, to buy a test or to commission one that would be fit for purpose for what they're using it. This is the ideal scenario of buying a test, doing one that's fit for the environment, tailor-made for the environment they're using. So, you know, if that is the scenario, I think both parties need to be involved with, you know, need to be knowledgeable about purpose.
Okay, and I have a question that's just popped up here around of self-assessment. What are your views on self-assessment and the use, I presume, of self-assessment within the classroom?
Well, I think that's a good question, because my doctorate, my dissertation was on self-assessment. And there's lots of research to show that different my topic was native background, and which native background or teaching philosophy you came from and how that impacted on your ability to self-assess, whether you overestimated or underestimated your skills. So there's a lot of research out there on the different native backgrounds. So, so that would have to be taken into advance. What I would say is that, you know, there's a difference between teaching versus testing. I think self-assessment is great in a teaching environment, but until you find out whether your students are accurately gauging their own levels and abilities, then it could be used in in different scenarios. But it's a great, you know, it's a great thing. It's a great activity to do, as is peer assessment. The same answers will apply to peer assessment.
Absolutely. And I have a question around the realities on the ground. So you mentioned in your presentation that often teachers lack the skills and knowledge necessary to write, shall we say, quality tests that we know are valid and reliable, and we'll get the information that we're seeking from that test. But in reality, our teachers are writing tests on a very basis without any formal training and without possible access to the testers that you mentioned that would be great collaboratively to work with, to learn from, and to, you know, in that. So what are practical steps then? I mean, you mentioned at the end about the mentoring and collaborative work, etc. But on a day-to-day basis, with the time constraints that we know teachers, we're all teachers, what are practical steps if a teacher really become assessment literate very soon?
Well, you know, assessment literacy does not take 2 or 3 years, okay? You can develop you know, in a couple of days, you can do all the basics. I think learning how to write a specification, or at least learning what a specification is, would be helpful, because then teachers who write different versions of tests would have kind of some guidelines. I think working together as well is important. And I think having as a final check a person who's never been involved in writing the test, to have that teacher take it as a student. Oftentimes, big mistakes pop up in a live administration because we don't have time to pilot, do we? So I think, and then also taking a look at the test after the fact, and, you know, if there were 1 or 2 little things that proved problematic, and then fixing those 1 or 2 things before we try to reuse it again. Oftentimes, and I've been guilty of this too, where, you know, you're so tired after the administration, the marking, then you're as a teacher, you're into the next assessment, and maybe you don't have time for those to revise your tests. So, and then the same time you administer, the next time you have the same issue there, and you think, oh, I forgot to fix that the last time. So going that extra step and making a decision whether you keep that test, or you take parts of this test, combine it with parts of this to make multiple versions, or if it's a total disaster area, maybe you need to retire it. If something has a few mistakes, maybe you can relegate it to like practice material. So having a situation where it's not a one-time use of a test is better for teachers. But also remembering that if you do decide to reuse tests, you have to make sure they're secure. You can't give tests back to students in that situation, because once they're in students' hands, they're in the public domain. And it's a good strategy for students to say, hey, Miss Christine is my teacher, to my former students. What kinds of tests does she do? That's a good strategy for a student to familiarize themselves with a teacher's testing practices, etc. And if they say, oh, here's a test she gave me last semester, and if I'm using the same test verbatim, not good. So any second use or multiple use of tests have to be secure and in the public and in a secure environment.
Okay, and I think one of the last questions we have for you today, Christine, and it's an excellent question, it's just popped up, is around, you're mentioning language assessment literacy skills, but can these assessment literacy skills that you're mentioning be used not just for language-based subjects, but obviously for other subjects?
I think so, of course. As you know, validity and reliability, the two most important properties of assessment, they're not just applicable to ELT or foreign languages, they're applicable to any kind of discipline. Although probably if you were doing, I often do workshops for teachers in other content areas, but I use my own examples from ELT. So yeah, I think everything is applicable to other areas or other fields of expertise.
Absolutely, the test development process would apply as well, the same as that would actually. Okay, so going to let you go a couple of minutes early because I know you'll run into class. And
yes, I am.
I think I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Christine Kuhn, for your very, very interesting presentation and your contributions in the question and answer session. And good luck in your class. Enjoy.
Thank you they're taking a test. Isn't that ironic? So, all
Good.
right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye,
Thank you, Christine.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And before we go into the tea break, I'd just like to reiterate some of the interesting points that Christine actually made around language assessment literacy, because it's obviously an aspect that the British Council is very much concerned with. I do like the idea of the book club, and perhaps I can discuss with my colleagues later about how we can perhaps even start that off perhaps in Uzbekistan. That might be an interesting, if anyone's interested, put that in the chat if you'd be interested in the British Council, perhaps our global assessment team starting a little book club. I think that might be quite fun around assessment literacy. And as Christine mentioned very clearly, language assessment literacy is not something you need to study for years. You can become at least far better literate in assessment, the practices and techniques within a few days. So I think we're going to let you go a bit early to the tea break today, because unfortunately Christine had to run to a class. So we'll be returning at, let me have a quick look, we'll be returning at 15:20 Uzbekistan time, so 3:20 Uzbekistan time, and that will be, I think, 10:20 UK time. Okay, and please continue the chat with your attendees, and we'll be looking in as well and perhaps answering some of your questions. So please enjoy your tea and coffee and continue the conversation in the chat room, and I'll see you back for a very interesting panel around how we help teachers through teacher education in language assessment literacy. And we have a lot of colleagues from around the world who'll be adding into that conversation, presenting initially, and then there'll be a long Q&A session, which I think you'll find very interesting. So please return at 13:20 Uzbekistan time, 10:20 UK time, and we'll see you then. Have a nice tea break. So welcome back to all our attendees, and welcome to all our speakers and our panelists. I'm going to pass you over to Keshav Sridharan, who is our Regional Exams Director for wider Europe, and he's going to be chairing our second panel of this conference and our panel for today, which will be entitled Improving Teaching and Learning by Improving Assessment Knowledge and Skills. But just before I pass you over to Keshav, please remember to post any of your questions for the panelists or relevant to this panel discussion in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague, Dr. Joanna Mottram, will be collecting those questions to then ask the panelists or pass to Keshav later. So no, without any further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Keshav. Keshav.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria, and I'm happy to be co-moderating this with Dr. Joanna. Now, continuing with our theme, which is preparing teachers to implement policy, we've had this exciting topic for panel discussion, which I hope would resonate with you all. I would bring each of the panel members first to start up with their introductory slides and what they feel about the topic, which would then open up the floor for discussions. We will do that in order, and I would request if each of the panel members can stick to a 5-minute timeline for presenting their insight, so that we leave enough time for Q&A at the end with the wider Uzbek delegation. So without taking too much of time, I would welcome the first panel member, which is Ninas Echaporia, Head of Academic English, based in British Council, India. Over to you, Ninas.
Thanks, Keshav. I'm just going to share my slides here as well, so everyone can see. Right, so just a quick introduction for myself. I head academic and teaching delivery for the British Council's online English language courses in India. I lead on the design and delivery of the courses, and I also manage a large remote teaching team leading on recruitment and teacher training. I've had an interest in assessment throughout my career. I trained on how language assessment works, a series of workshops for developing teachers' assessment literacy. And I also quality assured language tests that were administered to over 100,000 students across India. In terms of qualifications, I'm working on my MSc in digital education. I also have a Delta, a CELTA, and a certificate in ELT management skills. An issue I'd like to talk about today is the lack of linkages between learning outcomes and assessment, and how teacher training can be used to address this. And I'd like to start with an example of how making a small change to learning design can make a difference to assessment and learning outcomes. So I recently discussed a lesson with a teacher. It was for a pre-intermediate group of adult students. And the stated learning outcome of the lesson was to improve students' spoken fluency by teaching them how to use circumlocution, which is using explanations or examples to describe a word if you can't remember it, or if you don't know the exact word that you're looking for. At the start of the lesson, students brainstormed a list of items for a party. Then they played a game where one student tried to describe a word without naming it, and the other students tried to guess what that word might be. And then in the final stage, the teacher asked the learners to plan a party, and they had to choose items from a list of words at that stage. So here's an issue with this lesson. The stated lesson outcome is that learners would improve their spoken fluency using circumlocution. But the final practice task, you can see that it's got a list of words, and learners were already familiar with the words in this list. So there was no reason for them to use circumlocution. There was no reason for them to try and describe these items in their discussion. So I asked the teacher to think about how we could demonstrate the learning outcome of the lesson has been achieved, and that the learners are actually able to use this strategy in their speaking. So after our discussion, the teacher went back to her lesson and she tweaked the final practice activity a little bit. And instead of using a word list, she gave the learners a picture with many different items to choose from. And at this level, it's safe to assume that learners would know some of the items, but they may not know the names of all the items. And this created a great opportunity for them to use circumlocution. So by simply changing the task design, this activity now allowed the teacher to assess the impact of her teaching in real time. She could identify the learners who had grasped the concept being taught and those who maybe weren't doing so well, and to give them feedback. And this to me is an example of informal or ongoing assessment that takes place continually in any effective language program. And perhaps even without realizing it, good teachers assess learners in a variety of ways. And in fact, a lot of what we do in regular classroom practice can serve the purposes of assessment. So there is a tendency to consider assessment as big standardized tests or summative tests, achievement tests. But we know that this isn't the only type of assessment available to us. And this figure from Professor Sullivan's book, from his paper, represents all the different assessment opportunities on language programs. And I'm not suggesting we use all of them in any one program, that's far from it. But it is important for teachers to understand develop an understanding of the different assessment opportunities available and how they might use them appropriately. So we need assessment literacy which is the ability to interpret data from assessment, to use it to better learning outcomes and inform teaching decisions. And I'd like to say, I'm paraphrasing here from Professor Coombs' book, An A to Z of Second Language Assessment. By aligning the objectives of the course with both formal and informal assessment, I think teaching and learning practices may be made more effective. And here are my references.
Thank you. Thank you, Ninas. That was fantastic in articulating the lack of linkages between outcomes and assessments. And I'm sure that would generate a lot of food for thought amongst all our delegates who can feed into the Q&A box. Well, I'm moving on to the second panel member, who's from Uzbekistan. And I would like to welcome Nargiza Kuchkarova, who's the head of Teacher Selection and Capacity Building Department from the Agency of Presidential Education Institutions. Over to you, Nargiza.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Yes, the focus of my presentation will be on teacher assessment in terms of overall teachers, not only language teachers. As just let me introduce myself shortly. I'm a Hornby scholar, and what I'm doing now is I work as a head of recruitment and capacity building at the agency that deals with the schools, aiming to help students, gifted students, and they study Cambridge curriculum as part of their studies at school. So for that, what teachers are doing in just overall needs to be upgraded, and the teachers should be able to teach according to Cambridge requirements as well. Can we move to the next slide, let me say, please? Yeah, so far how we assess teachers' work, teacher performance. We have the State Inspectorate for Quality in Education. So what they do is they run the test for teachers of all subjects, and the overall score includes these 80% for knowledge test and 20% for methodological skills, which is not correct in our opinion, and we want to change it and to switch to just the opposite. Next slide. So we think that it's not the teacher knowledge that matters, but it's methodology. So not what they know, but what they can do in the classroom, what teachers do. Because we are talking about the competencies for students, not the knowledge. So in order to lead their students to match the 21st century requirements of the job market, we have to make that switch to skills rather than knowledge. And the same thing can be applied to the teacher development and the teacher assessment. So as part of this, we aimed at 80% for methodology, and as part of this, we will have, no, previous slide, please. We will have, we aim at digital portfolio of tasks, digital and offline portfolio, including lots of self-reflection. We want teachers to read and review the professional articles. We want them to provide some evidence of what they do as part of their everyday teaching. It could be a video and lesson observation. We want to go and visit these schools, as it's a small scale. We only have 26 schools, so in our case it is possible to do. And we want to encourage teachers to have their professional journal, professional diary, and to reflect on what they do and what others do, and what they read about teaching in that diary. So this is also something which will be not assessed but considered as part of that teacher assessment. And also we want teachers to learn and share in their small professional teacher communities, and their activeness is also going to be considered as the overall score. Next slide, please. yeah, so you can see this image of a teacher, let's say teacher. So we're talking about teacher empowerment, and it's important for us to give this idea to teachers that they can do that, so that they are assessed on their ability and their readiness to do that change in their own professional development. And also, it's not something that comes only from us. It's also, we have this newly reviewed teacher standards in Uzbekistan, and they are based on the competencies, not knowledge. So also, as part of presidential schools context, we have the presidential schools constitution, and a lot of things are they saying what teachers should be able to do in the classroom, how they are going to be assessed. So, and other agencies documents, they also they focus on that switch from knowledge to skills, and that the teachers should be able to teach 21st century, to try help students to develop 21st century skills in their classrooms. Yes. Yeah, and we aim to partner with different organizations. Just one thing is missed here. We are planning to do it with Cambridge Assessment as well, Cambridge International Assessment Education, as we plan to implement PDQ as part of CPB of our teachers. And also we want to make different courses with different partners. So now we're working on the module with world learning. So everything is going to be around helping teachers to do the classroom research, action research, to enable them to be in charge of their own learning and developing, and lots of things around reflection. So whatever we do, we want teachers to first of all to learn how to reflect on their own on what they do on their own teaching, and share this with their peers, and this way move in their professional development path forward. So that is.
Thank you, Nargisa. The 80-20 thing really resonates, around how much of importance we attach to subject knowledge over methodology and skill. Again, that's an area which I'm sure will generate a lot of interest amongst our delegates. Moving on to the third panel member from the British Council, which is Stephen Murray, who's the Senior Training Consultant from British Council, Taiwan. Over to you, Stephen. Can't hear you, Stephen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Murray, and I'm the Senior Training Consultant from Taiwan. I'd like to introduce myself today by telling you what we've been working on in Taiwan, and then you can see for yourself if there are parallels with what you've been doing in Uzbekistan. Yesterday we talked about test watchback on teaching. Here in Taiwan, in the past, the tests across the sector were generally focused on receptive skills and very little testing of speaking and writing. Also, English was taught as a subject rather than a tool of communication. So subsequently, there was a heavy focus on grammar and receptive skills. Now, as a result of programs that we've been delivering here, such as the baseline study that Ralph talked about yesterday, and also the Sprout project, which measured English language proficiency development pathways in universities, we've managed to work with the Ministry of Education and change the climate to a certain degree. We can say now that there's certainly a growing awareness that there's a need for a four-skilled testing regime across the sector. But in addition to that, attitudes to assessment have changed. There's been a move away from this high stake end of term summative test to introducing a range of assessment approaches in the classroom. And what we found out initially when that shift started to occur is that there wasn't really a very in-depth understanding of formative testing and how assessment can generate data that can inform and improve the classroom learning experience of the students. Our best practice teachers, though, they participated on a range of training programs, and they are changing the way that they approach assessment from the bottom up. Again, if we think about pedagogy, we had this idea 15 years ago, anyone can teach English. Well, anyone from certain countries can teach English. This led to limited focus on pedagogy in the classroom and a lack of best practice in comparison with international standards. In addition, there was a lack of any meaningful observation-based professional development programs. Again, with the work that we've been doing, we've introduced international standard programs such as the DIP TESOL, the TILEC, the CERT TESOL, and the CERT PT. And they're setting the standards really in terms of delivery. But there's also been changing understanding of the role of observational programs from an evaluative tool to a developmental tool. And this has led to open classrooms in at least the elementary school sector, where teachers can observe each other and learn from each other. And we've also got an expanded understanding of what an observation program is from a different perspective. By that, I mean, our trainers are not going into the classroom to observe changes in delivery approaches only. They're looking and integrating changes in curriculum and also changes in assessment practices. So we're trying to give those three areas equal levels of importance, if you like. Last but not least, Taiwan. In the past, the curriculum was loosely tied to the CEFR. Students were given autonomy, but not training in terms of how to create materials or indeed incorporate a range of assessment practices. We're happy to say that's changed as well. The Ministry of Education is very much for the CFRT. They're looking at models of incorporating that and also looking at lessons that can be learned from other countries that have localized or globalized, if you like, the CEFR. So we've moved into a very nice area, if you like. There's a growing understanding that educators, students need more discussion, dialogue, and support if they are to understand the interdependent relationships between curriculum delivery and assessment, or the comprehensive learning system, as we've talked about before. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. Very, very insightful on your experience. And yes, I think we would love to hear from you more. Last but not the least, our final panelist is Stephen King, who's the Senior Education Advisor from the Cambridge Partnership for Education. He's a very familiar face in Uzbekistan, having won a national medal for selfless work for development of public education, and has visited most inside out of Uzbekistan. So over to you, Stephen, as for your.
Hi, good morning from Cambridge. Good afternoon for those of you in Tashkent. I wanted to talk really more at a system-wide level, but I also wanted to borrow a theme that Nina spoke to in her presentation, which was alignment, and she mentioned that several times during her talk. I think to improve teaching and learning through assessment, alignment is critical. And by that, I mean sort of, horizontal alignment. So I think the curriculum, the classroom, what happens in the classroom, the textbooks, the teacher training, and the assessments need to align. If the assessment is not in the same place as the curriculum or not in the same place as the teachers or the textbooks, then that can cause problems. There's also a need for vertical alignment. So in Uzbekistan, you are blessed. You have a Ministry of Preschool Education now. You have a Ministry of Public Education. You have a Ministry of Higher Education as well. And you also have ministry level organizations such as the State Testing Center, and you've got the new Knowledge and Skills Assessment Agency as well. And so I think alignment between and communication within those organizations is also critical. Earlier this year, Cambridge, together with the British Council, worked together on this. We did some stakeholder engagement as part of a deep look into the national curriculum and how that could be structured. And one of the things that we found, and I worked together with Jamilia Bilyumova on this, who I think is here, was this idea of alignment and this idea of, making sure that each of the different parties are talking to each other is really something that's needed. What's also needed, though, is external alignment. And in Uzbekistan, you've got a really thriving private sector of language schools and exam centers and everything else. And we need to make sure that those students who are limited to the state sector have equity of access to the types of assessments that are available also in the private sector as well. And also, I think, I think we need to recognize that Uzbekistan, in terms of its system-wide improvements and in terms of its system-wide reform, moving towards reform of assessment is doing some really, really good things and is starting to do things in the right way, especially in the last few years. There's a new focus now on language education, and the new Agency for the Promotion of Foreign Language Education is a great initiative, and it's starting to do some really good work, and I've enjoyed working with them. But also at the school level, there are communities of practice. Teachers talk to each other a lot in Uzbekistan, and that is a really good and it's a really healthy thing to see. And I really enjoy hearing about these communities of practice that exist in every province of Uzbekistan. So I think, there are some ways for Uzbekistan to improve, particularly in this sense of aligning, and particularly between, the curriculum, the assessment, and the textbooks and everything else. But I'm really confident that organizations like the State Testing Center and everybody else can work together with the other agencies to bring about more stronger improvements in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I would ask all panel members, if you can, to switch on their cameras. Dr. Joanna as well. I'm handing over to Dr. Joanna now for the Q&A bits. Request all participants, any thought in your mind, any question, small, big, significant, insignificant, please use the Q&A box, and I'm sure our esteemed panel would love to answer. So over to you, Dr. Joanna.
Thank you very much, Keshav, and thank you to our panelists. I think we've opened up some really interesting areas to speak about, from what's happening in the classroom to what's happening at a policy level. So we have a lot to discuss. Now, my first move as Q&A manager is I'm going to reward someone for writing a question in the box. So the first question I'm going to ask is not one of the prepared questions, but it's actually going to be the one that's open in the box right now. And I think, Nagitsa, this is a question for you, possibly. We have the question there. I want to ask about changes to assess teachers' teaching abilities. So perhaps if you could share a little about how teachers' teaching abilities or methodologies and the appropriateness of those methodologies are being assessed in the presidential school system, and then perhaps how that might trickle down into other school systems.
Yeah, so actually the issue of teacher assessment is different all over the world, and there is no a clear answer how can we judge a good teacher or someone to improve. But for us, three things are clear. It's students' achievement. By the end of the studies, they have the exams, A-level, GCSE, and lesson observation. So when we can visit the class and see what's going on in the classroom, and also the feedback from students and parents. But in our case, we have the boarding school, so it's mostly like students, if not parents. So these three things for us is something that is more important maybe than other things like the MCQ test for knowledge of the subject and etc.
Thank you very much. And I think that's wonderful, because not only have you answered the question and reiterated your points from earlier, but also you've encouraged someone else to post a question in the box. And I think this one links to a question which was in the box slightly earlier, Stephen Murray, because we've been working on this question together a little bit with projects in Taiwan. The question that's come into the box right now, what are your tips for the improvement of educational system in terms of teaching foreign languages in higher education? And I think we can probably assume that we can talk about English as a foreign language in higher education system in Uzbekistan and in Taiwan. But also earlier there was a question or a request perhaps that the British Council support foreign teachers to go into the higher education system to support English language development there. Now, Stephen, you and I have had long conversations about this, so maybe we just keep it short, but would you have a response to these two linked questions?
Well, if we take the final question first, you know, what is the role in terms of bringing in foreign lecturers to help a local proficiency development plan? And I think there is a role, and the role is as experts or potentially master trainers. But if a program is to work, then as many of our speakers said yesterday, we absolutely need stakeholder buy-in. And within a relatively short period of time, we need local teachers to skill up and become master trainers and to cascade their knowledge. The answer is in the local teachers. That's what I've seen from my experience, but it's also supported by you know, a wealth of research as well.
Thanks, Stephen Murray. Now, this is going to get slightly confusing, but Steve King, you said before that you'd be interested in talking about policy. Do you have any opinions on this as being a high-level policy kind of decision about bringing in foreign talent, perhaps?
I do, yeah. And, you know, I spent many years in Japan, which has got a long-standing program called JET, where they've brought in teachers from all over the world since, you know, the 1980s. And I think although JET brings many benefits to Japan and it brings many benefits to the participants, I'm not convinced that one of those benefits has been a huge increase in the level of English language proficiency in Japanese society. And I'm not convinced that by simply importing native speakers into any jurisdiction, that will necessarily lead by osmosis to an increase in language proficiency in a country. I'm also not convinced that if something works or doesn't work in one jurisdiction or country, it's going to work or not work in another. And I don't really like this idea of policy borrowing, of, you know, taking something that works somewhere and just putting it unadapted somewhere else. But I think, you know, for Uzbekistan, there are a multitude of hugely talented and hugely committed language teachers. And if there is one policy that I would recommend, far and above the importation of foreign language teachers, would be to simply pay teachers in Uzbekistan better. And that's starting to happen. Teachers are starting to get incentives to pass you know, English proficiency examinations and to demonstrate their English language proficiency. That to me is surely a more effective way I think it's more effective for Uzbekistan too, given what I know about the context.
Thanks very much. Did anyone else want to add anything on that particular topic?
I would just say, in addition to pay, what about professional development opportunities as well? We can have we can have our teachers, you know, becoming our local teachers, having an extra career path by becoming master trainers and cascading their knowledge across the country.
I think, Steve, you've just picked up on something that I'm going to go back to what Nagitsa was saying before about teacher professional development, because you've pulled in professional development opportunities for a different career path, things like that. My personal experience, that the reason I'm now sitting here today was through my master's degree. I started doing action research. And the experience of action research, apart from the reflection and the improvement in my teaching practice, was the realization that educational research was a real thing that needed to be done, that I could turn into my career. So action research is wonderful. And there are really amazing programs around the world which encourage people to do action research, particularly in ELT. Nagitsa, how do you make sure, this is like a 2 or 3 part question, how do you make sure that your teachers have the resource available to participate in action research? Because it's intensive and a lot of reflection is required. But then I also want to link into something that you mentioned before. How do they share it? Because I think these communities of practice or teacher sharing groups could be an incredible resource for sharing language assessment literacy. So 2 parts, how do they have the time? And 2, how do they share about their action research?
Okay, so shall I start with the last part? That's the idea. So we can encourage teachers to do that. We can encourage them to write the professional diary and participate in the communities of practice. But if the whole thing is not part of the what we call attestation, when teachers don't know that they're going to have the, you know, if someone is monitoring the thing and the process, and this is going to be part of their score, overall score. So from our practice, based on my background knowledge, they won't be motivated to do that. So it's the issue of internal and external motivation, if you want. So we are doing our best to implement our own system of attestation, where all what you mentioned is going to be considered as their portfolio for upgrading their category. In Uzbekistan, we have these categories, so 4 categories. So for teachers, it's a chance to upgrade their category and to have the salary bonus or the salary increase. And as for the first part about the resources, so for me, to do the resource, to do the action, the classroom research or action research, or it's more about using this reflective practice instrument. So the resource is the teacher himself or herself and their students. So what you do in the class, you try something new, you go through that cycle, you try something new, you get the feedback, or you reflect on it, you share it with your colleagues, you update it, upgrade it, and you try again. So teachers and students and the teaching itself is the biggest resource for a teacher who wants to improve. And of course, the issue of the professional literature, for example, is the matter of, we come to the issue of lack of English for teachers of other subjects. For this, we are now getting these articles translated for non-language teachers. We want them to have the access to something very simple, digestible, transferable, so pieces of reading that can help them to improve, to develop. I hope that was the answer to your question. If not, let me know.
I think we had multiple answers to multiple questions, but all relevant and important for us today. I promised Ninaz that I really wanted her to review something from her presentation. And it's linked to a question that's been popping up in our question and answer box over the last couple of days. We seem to have maybe some confusion or maybe some assumptions about formative and summative assessment and how they're useful in language learning or in teaching and learning. And I was just wondering, Ninaz, for me personally, Barry O'Sullivan's diagram that you showed us earlier has been really helpful in understanding how assessment can fit together in systems. So if you could share that slide again, possibly, and then just talk to us a little bit about the formative, summative, doesn't have to be a binary kind of idea. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing. I think we tend to think in terms of binaries. And as I said, there is a tendency to think of assessment. When you hear the word assessment, you think of a formal big test and lots of learners sitting in a room and scribbling away while an invigilator watches them. And you think of a big standardized test or an achievement test, a summative test. But I think that all of these different types of assessment can be used in various ways. And I think as teachers and also as curriculum developers, we need to think carefully about what assessment we would like to use and at which point. Joanna, you talked about summative tests, or they're also often called achievement tests, which come at the end of a program of learning. And the purpose of these is generally evaluative and generally to kind of look back at the learning program and see how many learners have actually achieved what the language program set out to deliver. But you can see that there are different types of assessment through the program here as well. So you've got your progress tests here, or progress assessment. And I think this is what the purpose of this could be developmental. So the purpose of this could be to actually feed back into the language program to see how well we're doing at this point and what we can maybe tweak and change in the future. And as I mentioned during my presentation, I think just at a teacher level, good teachers are doing this in their classrooms anyway, whether they call it assessment or not, but they are innately doing this. They're checking if their students have actually understood, learned, if they can produce the language that they wish them to produce, and then making tweaks, planning the next lesson in response to what happened in the previous one. And I don't necessarily think there needs to be a dichotomy in the sense that we seem to think of these two things as clashing and that they cannot coexist sometimes. I think they can coexist, and there is a need to think through which of these assessment opportunities to use. And I think Professor O'Sullivan in his paper very clearly also states that we aren't intended to throw all of these assessment opportunities into any one program. We don't want to over-test, but the idea is to choose quite judiciously and pick from the best of the crop. I would highly recommend this paper. It's quite short and digestible and extremely clearly written and easy to understand even for a teacher to read. And I'll just be putting the link to this in the chat box as well, if anyone would like to have a look at that.
Thanks, Ninaz. That was almost seamless and almost like we talked about doing it during the break, but thank you very much for putting that link in, because I must agree that that's a really helpful paper to read. If you're thinking about assessment and assessment in the classroom, but also if Stephen King, you're thinking about assessment in aligned systems. And we were treated to a Barry presentation yesterday on the comprehensive learning system. So when you started talking about alignment just before, I really quickly went comprehensive learning system. And then you talked about horizontal alignment, and then you talked about vertical alignment, which is lovely. And you raised something that I thought of yesterday, because we had a panel session yesterday where we had representatives from agencies, important agencies in Uzbekistan speaking. And I was wondering, how do all of those alignment discussions happen, and how do those conversations and agreements happen? And perhaps you can reassure us by telling us a little bit about that. I think that would be really, really helpful, but please don't tell any secrets that I'll get in trouble for asking you.
No, you know, Uzbekistan has probably got more educational agencies than anywhere else that I know, and there's several involved in assessment, you know, but I think organizational alignment complements that vertical and horizontal alignment very well, and I think, you know, it's essential that, you know, the ministries, plural, of education work together with some of these agencies tasked with things like assessment and things like language education, and also the agencies tasked with things like teacher training and the agencies tasked with special education needs development. All of those needs to align, I think. And the Republican Education Centre that deals with curriculum too. I'm not going to be particularly controversial by saying that that alignment hasn't always been there. And I think people in Uzbekistan know that and accept that, and they see that. And that's not being critical in any way. It's just a recognition of how it is. But I think now that recognition is there, I see genuine efforts for those agencies to work together and to align. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, but there are some really good things happening across not only language education, but, you know, STEM subjects and everything else. And externally as well, the international partners are beginning to align as well. The UK partners and the US partners aren't fighting with each other anymore. And that's always good to see. So that there are some really good things happening. And I think that Uzbekistan is definitely moving in the right direction in these terms.
That's perfectly reassuring and great news indeed. And I think that reiteration of alignment and foregrounding of alignment is wonderful news for Uzbekistan, but also things that we can take into our projects in Taiwan and India as we work with our colleagues around the world. It's very important for all of us. I wonder if we could redirect back to, I guess, the topic of the panel today, which was language assessment literacy and how that can improve teaching and learning. I was wondering, Nina, if you could tell us a little bit, in your role as head of teaching and delivery in the really wonderful online teaching group that you work in, how do you incorporate language assessment literacy training for your teachers in that group?
Yeah, so we've offered various types of training over the past several months and years, recognizing that this is a really important skill that we want to develop in our teachers. So of course, we have focused on a lot in the way I talked about in my presentation. So one way of doing it is through teaching observations, actually working with the teachers in terms of their lesson plans. And that helps us in terms of informal or ongoing assessment that happens during a lesson itself. We've also run the How Language Assessment Works series of workshops for our teachers. That's a series of workshops run by the British Council, face-to-face and online, which help develop teachers' assessment literacy, and something I would highly recommend as a way of developing a sort of novice teachers' awareness around assessment and how to actually implement it in the classroom. The videos and worksheets from that, I think, are available on our global website as well. So if you can't attend a full workshop, you can actually go and review those. We've also encouraged our teachers to do the language assessment in the classroom Mooc on Futurelearn, which is the British Council's massive open online course in this area. And I think, Joanna, you'd shared the link to that earlier in the day. This is a great way to learn about language assessment and also connect with other educators around the world and other people interested in assessment, because the Mooc is obviously open to everyone globally. And we, from time to time, we invite experts in assessment to train on specific aspects of assessment. So we invited you, for example, Joanna, obviously you talked about specific aspects of IELTS test preparation and the writing tasks specifically around those. So when we need more specialist expertise, we kind of reach out to the network and look at what's available.
Thank you. We didn't see that bit where she embarrassed me about being an invited expert, but it has been an excellent learning opportunity to share expertise. Stephen Murray, I'm thinking about higher education training instructors in higher education and how you weave language assessment literacy into that training and what impact it has on the instructors you work with. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's changed massively over the last 10 to 15 years. 15 years ago, we didn't weave it, it was separate. Now that's changed, and I can give you a very specific example of how that's changed. So we'll work with lecturers or indeed teachers across the educational sector. They'll identify their coursebook material and they'll choose materials that they want to use. Our workshop will then be, say, a typical task-based learning session where we go through that session, introducing TBL, getting the teachers to develop their understanding of how they would teach it. So far, quite traditional. But then we say, well, okay, you've just delivered a lesson using 21st century methodologies. Now, look at that lesson again. Go back to it and tell me how you can use that lesson as a tool of assessment. And then we get them to answer questions like, what form of assessment would you use, when would you use it, and why would you use it? And what we actually find when we do that is, you know, a teacher who has told you, I have no idea what formative assessment for learning is at the start of the session, realizes that what they're doing, as Nina says, innately in the classroom is a form of assessment for learning, and they are developing their language assessment literacy as a result of that practical approach. And we found that has worked extremely well.
Thanks, Stephen. We had this question earlier during Christine Coombs' presentation, which was unfortunately missed during the question and answer. I thought it was a great question. It was how can we change students' perception of assessment of learning? How can that perception, assessment of learning, be changed to assessment for learning? So I think that's we as teachers, how can we move that focus away from assessment of learning and then reframe assessment to assessment for learning? And I can see everyone sort of doing their thinking faces there. But I wanted to make this a very open question. We have only a few minutes left. So this one is a really nice perception changing question. Stephen King, you look like you're ready to go.
You know, I know it's a really complicated question, actually. It sounds simple, but it's complicated. But there are some quite easy changes you can make. And I think one of them is there tends to be, and this is across all school subjects, an over-reliance in some countries on simple multiple choice questions. And they are the classic assessment of learning item format, are they not? You know, what is this fact? Is it A, B, C, or D? Did you learn this? Yes, no, or no, or no. And so, you know, switching from straight multiple choice formats to more open-ended formats is a way to fairly simply move from assessment of learning to assessment for learning. It's not easy though, because of course, open-ended questions take longer to mark, and there's an expectation that end of school exams will be marked in several days, and people in Uzbekistan love to get their exam results back immediately. So it's not as easy as it sounds, but that's one switch that you can make, one switch that everyone can understand that people could make.
I think another key issue here is something that's ran through the conference as a theme so far, stakeholder involvement. We don't just need the teachers to understand what assessment for learning is. We need the students to understand what assessment for learning is. And if they go through activities in the classroom and they're given opportunities to reflect and understand how that's helped them develop, they can feed that knowledge back into the system, in peer activities, group-based activities. So I think a key element of a switch to assessment for learning is also, the stakeholder involvement of the students themselves. Yeah.
Just wondering if Ninas, you're ready to go on this. I thought you'd
I wanted to add just one point. To the points that Stephen and Stephen Murray made, is I think also the role of feedback here. So I think one of the key things about shifting from assessment of learning to assessment for learning is that obviously with assessment for learning, there's a feedback channel back to the students based on the assessment. And I think that's a very simple, again, it seems simple to do, but it's not that simple. But I think that that's a key thing. So if feedback can flow, then even if it is generally with a summative test or an achievement test, it's used for making judgments and it has an evaluative purpose, not so much developmental, because that feedback isn't used to improve learner performance. But what if it were? So I think that that's one of the questions to consider as well.
And I'm just feeling, Nagitsa, would you like to close the circle on this particular question? Or?
Yes, I totally agree with Ninas, and from the point of view of teacher assessment, again, it's not, of course, assessing what they already know or can do, but it's the assessment with the goal of encouraging them to develop and showing them the new horizons and supporting them. It's more about supporting rather than assessing, I would say, supporting to develop.
Thank you. I'm nodding away both at you, but also at Ninas, because she's picked up a question in the chat box that she really wants to answer. And I was about to send that one over. I wonder if you're going to say what I was going to say. But while Ninas is answering this one, if the rest of the panelists could perhaps start thinking about a closing statement that you'd like to make or any kind of closing comments. So we'll ask Ninas to respond to this question from Rima Sotakova about implementing self-assessment in the classroom. And then a second tricky part about how do we evaluate it, which is an interesting part. But after Ninas has addressed that, I'll invite you all to deliver a bit of a closing statement before we move on. So Ninas, over to you.
Yeah, fantastic question, I have to say. There are a variety of ways, and I couldn't possibly touch on upon all of them right now, but a couple of ideas about how you can implement self-assessment in the classroom. And again, it comes from that lovely diagram from Professor Sullivan's article. I mean, a simple way is, of course, if the learning program is aligned to the CEFR, then the CEFR can-do statements are a great way. You can turn the can-do statements into, can I do this, into questions to pose to the learners at regular points in the program, and to get them to self-assess where they are in terms of those skills for their level. It's also a great way to make them aware of the aims of the learning program as well, because when you present those points, they're forced to think about what they've learned and how that has come through the course. I mean, another example could be just a simple reflection at the end of each lesson. So closing each lesson with a reflection on the lesson, and simple prompts on how you feel after the lesson, how you feel about the language point learned, how confident you feel using it. And this really has two purposes, because on the one hand, the student is reflecting for themselves, but it's very useful information for the teacher. And it's a great way of collecting ongoing real-time information about the effectiveness of a lesson, about how comfortable a student felt with a particular lesson or not. So I think those are two quick ideas. There are a variety of ways how to evaluate it. Personally, for me, of course, I think evaluation is important to see whether it's effective or not. But I think the process of reflection itself is just a really important skill. It also links to lots of 21st century and core skills that we're trying to teach students. So I think it's the process that's really, really important. In terms of evaluating, I'm not sure if, we want to evaluate the self-assessment as well. I think it's something it's worth doing for the practice of doing it and for sort of flexing those mental muscles. But I mean, feel free to disagree with me, of course.
I don't think I need to disagree. I think we're very well aligned. It's a very nice example there of how closely we're aligned. Keshav, did you want to manage the closing part, or what would you like to do?
No? Happy for you to continue, Joanna. The floor.
Okay, well, how about we follow our order from before almost. So we'll invite Nagitsa first, and then Stephen Murray, then Stephen King, and then Ninaz will give you some thinking time, as you've just told us a lot. So Nagitsa, would you like to make a couple of closing statements just for a minute or two?
Yes, thank you for attention and interesting questions. So I just wanted to point out that what we're now talking about is all in the something that must happen and should happen in the nearest future, but it's not something which is already in process, but we're working on making that happen. So, and if teachers have ideas, they can always address us, and they can always write to us, and we're happy, we're open to any ideas and suggestions. And thank you for organizing this conference. It's really useful for all teachers of the agency now joined the conference. So, and they're very, they are sharing their very positive impressions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to reiterate back in your direction how heartening it is to see the investment that you're making in improving teaching and learning with the intention of cascading all of those improvements. So it seems like a very well designed intervention to start small and then work through the system with those interventions.
Yes, this is the idea of the idea behind creating our agency. We can implement this new ideas, new projects, new approaches at the smaller scale, only 26 schools, and then pass it over to the public education system to be implemented countrywide. Yes, it's much easier to try something with a smaller number of teachers. But teachers are the same everywhere. It doesn't matter where they work, but they yeah, so we hope that we will pass it over in the future.
Thank you very much. I promised then Stephen Murray that you would come next.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think, seminars like this can have the effect of raising people's awareness of this interdependence and interconnected nature of delivery approaches in the classroom, curriculum development, and assessment. So a seminar like this is already a good start. So let's keep having conversations like this. And the other thing that I'd like to say very quickly is that, from my personal experience, I do a lot in a day, but I don't really feel as though I achieve anything in a day or achieve much in a day. But when I look back over the last 15 years and the change in the landscape that's occurred in Taiwan, I realized that I've achieved much more than I think I do in an individual day. So the moral of that story is just be patient. You don't always see the impact of your changes, but if you're making changes in the right direction, they will have this soil creep effect and build and build and build.
Thank you. Stephen King.
I wanted to really just give a real positive note on where Uzbekistan is. And Uzbekistan, with its language education, in fact, with its education system in general, is in a really good and positive place. And, that's shown by, the leadership that there is in the country. The minister is a fluent English speaker. A lot of his deputy ministers are, many of his staff are. The Ministry of Preschool Education is a fluent English speaker. The head of the Language Promotion Agency is. And it's just excellent to see the leadership in the country modeling that behavior. The communities of practice that happen all over the country, in schools, up in every province, in every town and city in Uzbekistan, these things happen, and they're wonderful to see. Those are just fantastic. It would be remiss of me to mention the new textbooks that have come in that were licensed from Cambridge University Press, generously funded by USAID. We're very happy to be associated with that, and we think that they are a good resource for Uzbekistan. We don't think they're the be-all and end-all of the system, but we're proud of that. But one thing that I think really highlights the impact is the fact that at Nargiz's institution, at the presidential schools, just 2 years ago, they took in students from 4 cities who came across 4 different provinces. And they came in with a level of English, regardless of their economic background and everything else. And they were able to access the Cambridge International A-level curriculum and came out of it 2 years later with an excellent set of A-level results that enabled them to go on to universities in the UK, in the US, in Uzbekistan. And there are some really good stories there of individual students who've gone on and worked hard, but they were able to access the curriculum in the first place because they had a good, solid foundation of English through the public education that they'd enjoyed. So I think, the temptation is often to say at these events, oh, we've got to improve this, we've got to improve that. Uzbekistan is in a good place, and it's got there without importing thousands of native English speakers and people who happen to look like myself and Steve Murray. And you, Johanna, as well.
Yeah, I did notice that we do look quite similar, Stephen.
People could quite easily get us mixed up, I think. Yeah.
That was a big challenge as we moved into this with 2 Stephens. But anyway, I think we've got it sorted out. I'd like to invite Ninas to speak again as a closing statement.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. I'd like to pick up on something Dr. Poom said in her plenary, and when she was talking about language assessment literacy, she mentioned 3 components. What do I know and understand about assessment and testing? What do I do with what I know? And what do I do to improve what I know? And I really want to address that last point with a personal example. When I started out in my career teaching in a classroom in Delhi, I really thought assessment was handed down to me from the powers that be, and it was what I did at the middle of the course and at the end of the course, and that was assessment to me. And it was only through trial and error, through reaching out, through learning more about assessment myself as a teacher, that I began to really understand my role in assessment and the role that I play, and that it is an important one. So I wanted to say that as academic heads or leaders, we need to create opportunities for our teachers to learn more about assessment and to recognize the important role that they play in the entire system and in assessment itself.
Which is a wonderful segue, really, Ninas. Thank you so much. We are so aligned tonight. Because I wanted to pick up on what Stephen's talked about and Nagitsa's talked about in the idea of these communities of practice and teacher sharing groups. And I think, Ninas, this links to what you're talking about as well. So making good use of these teacher sharing groups and communities of practice and sharing more information about language assessment. And perhaps, as Christine Kroon mentioned earlier, thinking about this book club idea or reading group idea. I know that several of the language assessment associations in my region, so ALTANS, which is Australia and New Zealand, and the Asian Association both have these kinds of reading groups. So maybe this is something that we can take from this session and say, well, we've learned a lot from each other. Let's go out and share it through this kind of mechanism. So very exciting. I'm going to hand to Keshav. I think I've gone 1 minute over. Thank you, everyone.
No, so fascinating and so insightful that we barely noticed going over time. But no, anyway, I wanted to thank all the panelists for kind of presenting their insights, presenting their on-ground experience, and also to all our delegates who've attended. Almost at we have more than 350 logins to this session, and there were lots of interesting Q&As, interesting takeaways to pick on. So yes, the recordings for all this session, the presentations are available. We're recording the sessions live. They will be put on YouTube soon. So don't worry, in case you can always go back and revisit aspects of certain parts of the discussion which you may have missed. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to all the delegates again. And I hand over to Dr. Victoria Clark from the British Council to take things forward.
And thank you again to all the panelists and yourself, Keshav and Dr. Mottram. Thank you very much. Fantastic panel. I really enjoyed it, as I know everyone else did in the audience from all the comments in the chat box that I've been following. Now, just before I hand you over to Hugh Moss from Cambridge, I'm going to quickly summarise the plenary and the panel, if I may, and then we'll move on to the workshop by Hugh. I just thought I'd reiterate really what Christine Coombe has been saying, Dr. Christine Coombe, about the importance of language assessment literacy and what teachers need to know. And again, focusing on the fact that we don't need 2 years to become language experts, language testing experts for the classroom. We can start in small steps and quite quickly to become better at what we do in assessment in the classroom within a few days. And I think she also focused on online assessment and current research in the questions, which I think we all found very interesting. And then the panel discussion, I won't need to reiterate that too much, but certainly some of the main messages was really on linking, obviously, assessment to the outcomes, obviously, the need for professional development of the teachers, the need to be active in their community, and obviously the shift from 2 skills to 4 skills in testing to have better washback on student outcomes within the classroom. And the whole idea of alignment was again brought up by our friend in Cambridge, Stephen King, around that alignment, both horizontal and vertical, and the very interesting question and answer session. Now, I'd like to move on now to our final session of the day, unfortunately, which is a workshop by Hugh Moss. Now, Hugh Moss is Assessment Group Manager at Cambridge Assessment. He has nearly 30 years experience in ELT and is responsible for overseeing the production and assessment of Cambridge English teaching qualifications. Previously with Cambridge English, he was an advisor to Ministries of Education, other educational bodies, and managed a range of complex projects from modernisation of exams, processing to reform of English language testing in Colombia. Now, today, his workshop is Cambridge English Teaching Knowledge Test and its impact. So before I hand over to Hugh, just very quickly, day 3 is tomorrow. It's going to focus on teachers and how teachers implement policy on the ground in the classroom. We're going to have an excellent plenary by Tom Kiddle, director of NILE, who many of you may know. He's has a lot of experience working in Uzbekistan, and he's really going to, I think, continue that conversation that Dr. Coombe started and talk about exactly what teachers need to know in order to be assessment literate. Then there'll be a very interesting panel on translating and embedding theory into actual practice for teachers. And then at the end of day 3 tomorrow, myself and my colleague Mark O'Sullivan, who's behind the scenes, if anyone can see him answering questions and in the chat room, we'll be given a workshop ourselves on aptis for teachers. But we're going to be focusing on the productive skills of speaking and writing and how we assess speaking and writing at B2 and C1 levels, which we feel is of absolute relevance in Uzbekistan context. So we're looking at B2.
No, it's all right, I think.
So hi, Hugh, how are you? Hi, Hugh, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Just about
Sorry.
ready. Go on,
Okay, well, just give me a second, please.
No problem.
I've got multiple screens open here, and it's not the
No
easiest
problem.
navigating around them. So yes, hello, I'm Hugh Moss, and I work for Cambridge Assessment English as Assessment Group Manager within the Teaching and Curriculum team. And I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'd like to start off by thanking you all for attending this session.
Okay, I'll hand over to you completely then, Hugh. I'm in the background if you need me.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So my role is to oversee a team of assessment specialists who work on producing the Teaching Knowledge Test, which is the subject of my presentation today. The Teaching Knowledge Test is provided by Cambridge Assessment English, part of the University of Cambridge, and is taken by candidates in over 80 countries around the world. And just in terms of the aims of my presentation, it's to give an overview of the Teaching Knowledge Test, which we tend to abbreviate to TKT, to give some background to its development, to explain its impact, focusing on a case study in Mexico, and finally, to give an opportunity for some questions and answers. So in terms of the overview of TKT, it was first introduced by Cambridge way back in 2005. So it's been going for around 16 years now. And I'll talk about the development of the test shortly, but first a quick overview of its purpose and format first. Well, TKT is a modular test, which is designed to test teachers' knowledge in specific areas, such as grammar and factors in the language learning process, and can be taken after either a preparation course or self-study. And the tests are designed to encourage teachers in their professional development and provide a step in their progression on the Cambridge English Teaching Framework. And the framework presented here describes teacher competencies across 4 stages of their development and identifies the key knowledge and skills needed for teaching effectively at a variety of levels and in different contexts. And we've got the competency areas in the left-hand column, such as learning and assessment, language, knowledge and awareness. And when we look at the TKT modules, you'll see that most of these areas are focused on within the tests. And mapping our most popular teaching qualifications to the framework, we can see that TKT sits somewhere between CELTA and DELTA, i.e. between foundation and developing levels. So foundations for teachers at the beginning of their career with little or no experience, and then developing, you know, after teachers have been teaching some while and have gained some experience and knowledge. So the test is suitable for teachers with a range of experience. So as I said, who's it for? So in a bit more detail, teachers who wish to gain an international certificate and increase their confidence, teachers of primary, secondary or adult learners in state or private schools, teachers with little or no experience, or teachers with experience but little formal training, and teachers with training and experience but who want to refresh their teaching knowledge. Okay, well, I've got a question for you now. Do you know how many TKT modules there are and what are they called? So you could put your messages in the chat if you like. Oh, yes, we're getting some answers here. Thank you very much. So, yeah, we've got a range of answers. I think between you, you've got the right answers. So some people saying 3 modules. Ah, now we're getting to somebody's come up with, yeah. So some people saying 4. Yeah, some people saying 3, which is not a wrong answer exactly. And someone's come up with a very good answer. So let's see. Sorry, just try and find my mouse again. In fact, there are a total of 5 modules. And there are core modules, which are called modules 1, 2, and 3, focusing on the background to language teaching, planning for language teaching, classroom management. And then there are 2 specialist modules, young learners and content and language integrated learning, or CLIL. And each of the modules has 80 questions and lasts for 80 minutes, and they are all paper-based tests. And I'll go into more detail on the specific modules in a little while. So TKT was designed to offer its test takers or users flexibility and choice. So it allows teachers to demonstrate knowledge of specific areas of teaching methodology in different areas. And it's possible to do just one of the modules or as many modules as you might want in any order. So you could do, for example, TKT module 2 this year and possibly CLIL next year. In terms of preparation, you can take a course of study or you can prepare yourself if you want, it's up to you. And certificates are issued on completion of each module. The test is on demand, so there's no scheduled dates for it. It can be done virtually any day of the year, subject to getting in touch with Cambridge English network of exam centres where you would take the test if you wanted to do it. And I noticed there are already a couple of Cambridge exam centres in Uzbekistan where potentially TKT could be taken. And here's a quote from one of our TKT test takers, a teacher in Romania, which sums up the impact that taking TKT had for her. So she said, I chose to take TKT exams because they effectively help you become a better teacher, improve your teaching style, make you become more efficient, offer challenging strategies, and to my mind, they're really helpful. And I think when I move on later to talk about the case study in Mexico, you'll see that those viewpoints were also expressed by the teachers there. So in terms of the reach of the qualification, well, it operates in, as I said, over 80 countries, but the top countries last year were China, Mexico, Russia, Kazakhstan, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, India, and Vietnam. I should say that because the test is paper-based, there were some disruptions due to COVID. You know, because you need to go to exam centres to take the test. So that situation is not ideal, but has improved in several countries, and naturally we hope it will improve further still. And in terms of recognition, TKT is widely recognized across the globe by a variety of institutions, including ministries of education in Mexico and Thailand, and also the Hebei Provincial Education Department in China. So for people who take the test, it's widely accepted and recognized. Okay, so I've given a bit of an overview of TKT, and now I'm going to move on to give some information about the development of the tests. So looking at this diagram, it shows the test development process, which Cambridge uses in the production of its tests. So at the top left-hand corner, you'll see it says perceived need for a new test. So yes, indeed, like with any product, we need to establish the need to create a test, e.g. to satisfy customer demand, or where we think there's a gap for this particular type of testing. Once we've established that demand, we then go on to the planning stage, where we define the intended use of the test based on who will take the test and what their needs are. And these needs inform the design of the test, i.e. to ensure that it tests what it's intended to test, paying attention to both theoretical issues such as test validity and practical aspects such as the duration of the test. We don't want it to be too long or too short. And these considerations then inform the design stage, where the key output is a set of initial test specifications. Once we've got those initial test specs, we then move on to the development phase, which involves producing some of the test material, which is then trialed on a representative sample of would-be test takers around the world. And then we get the data back from that trial, and we consider then if the test is working as intended. And at this stage, we might make amendments to the test design and retrial with the aim of coming up with a finalized set of test specifications. And the operationalization stage then includes the production of test item and construction of test versions for live use. Not just with newly designed tests, but in fact with all the Cambridge English tests, we undertake regular reviews to make sure that they're still fit for purpose as contexts change over time. And we may need to consider if any changes need to be made to the test design or certain sections of the test, in which case we will make the revisions accordingly. But it is a complicated and quite a lengthy process sometimes. And we have to be mindful, of course, that when we introduce test revisions, because people may be preparing for an existing format, and there's also publisher materials often associated with this. So there's a lead-in period before we make revisions to any test. I mentioned before that the test was launched by Cambridge English in 2005, and it was designed to test the knowledge of the teaching of English to speakers of other languages and targeted at practicing or trainee English language teachers. TKT was developed to provide a quick, flexible and cost-effective means of assessing teachers' knowledge of concepts related to language, language use, and the background to and practice of language teaching and learning. It is not intended to assess teachers' teaching ability, their performance in the classroom, or their proficiency in English language. In other words, the test aims to test teachers' declarative or received knowledge rather than their procedural knowledge. So it's about the what they know as opposed to how they apply it in the classroom. So you might be asking, well, why assess declarative knowledge? Well, there are different ways to assess knowledge of teaching and teaching practice. And as with any test, the nature of the assessment will be dependent upon the purpose of the test. Cambridge CELTA and Delta courses both involve assessment of teaching practice and a combination of written assignments and or exams. But that does imply for the observation of lessons that we have trained assessors who need to be standardized every year, and they need to visit schools or attend online observations. So it's quite a complicated process. And of course, that means there's also some cost involved in that process. TKT, on the other hand, is assessed via means of a test with no assessment of teaching. So, well, earlier on I talked about the practical aspects when designing tests within the context in which they'll be used. And one of the reasons it was decided to test teachers' declarative knowledge was due to this factor. Assessing declarative knowledge via a test is more straightforward than assessing teachers' procedural knowledge through classroom observations, and as a result is a quicker and cheaper alternative for delivery. Also, the marking of multiple choice items is relatively easy. It's very reliable, it's automated, and the tests allow for a standardized comparison of teachers' performance across the globe. And such tests also enable large cohorts of teachers to be tested with quick turnaround of results, i.e. around 2 weeks. There are several ways to prepare for TKT, i.e. by taking a preparation course, which are available at a range of centres in different places and countries, or by studying independently, or of course by using official preparation materials and handbooks from Cambridge English. In the process of preparing for TKT, that can actually help bridge the gap between declarative knowledge of teaching concepts, language use and teaching methodology, and their practical application in the classroom, as hopefully teachers will reflect upon what they have been learning and consider how to apply it in their everyday teaching. So hence the three diagrams here with the course meant to bridge the gap between theory and practice, as it were. Earlier on, when talking about test development, I referred to the operational phase. That's quite difficult to say. And I thought it might be interesting to describe to you in a bit more detail about how we produce tests in Cambridge. Well, as a starting point, just want to say we've got the equivalent of a giant electronic bank where we store hundreds of thousands of test questions and test versions. But we also, alongside them, have data related to the test performance and attributes of each test, such as their testing focus. We start the process by running an audit of the test bank to determine if we need to produce more test items or questions to construct new test versions. And new test versions are needed to ensure there's not overexposure of a particular test version, which could compromise the test security or integrity of the materials. If we need a new test version, we commission a team of item writers to produce this material. And these item writers are assessment specialists who have years of ELT experience and an in-depth knowledge of the test that they are writing for. Once they've written the material, which they've been commissioned to do so, it's then subject to pre-editing, where it is scrutinized by the chair of the paper they're writing for, and also our in-house assessment managers or specialists. And there are basically two outcomes at this stage. Either the material is accepted or it is rejected. Accepted materials then pass to the editing stage, where there's a more detailed look at individual test questions to ensure that they are working suitably. For example, it's very important to ensure that each question only has one possible answer. And at this stage, there may be some rewriting of the test material before it's sent to the next stage, which is pre-testing. So a bit more information on the diagram now. Pre-testing is a process whereby we trial test item materials on a representative sample of candidates around the world to see if they're performing as expected. E.g., the right level of difficulty and no issues with the wording of tasks, etc. We always review the pre-testing data we receive to check these aspects. And provided the results are as expected, we designate the materials for live use. Test construction is the final stage where we select a combination of tasks from within the bank to form a complete test, which has to undergo a series of rigorous quality assurance checks before it can be approved for live use. And these checks include multiple vetting stages and proofreading. And if you're interested in learning more about the process, then you can download the Principles of Good Practice, which has been produced by Cambridge English at the address shown. So there's a PDF of the document, and it describes all aspects of our quality assurance procedures. Okay, well, now let's have a bit more of a detailed look at the individual TKT modules with the opportunity for you to test your knowledge. Let's see. As I mentioned earlier on, there are 3 cores and 2 specialist modules. So looking first at TKT module 1, it consists of 80 questions and lasts for 80 minutes. And the question types are multiple matching, multiple choice, and odd one out. And the module test teachers' knowledge of terms and concepts common in English language teaching. It also focuses on the process of learning English knowledge and of the range of methods, tasks, and activities available to the language teacher. So in terms of the areas to be covered in the first 3 sections of the module, so this is the first section, which is describing language and language skills. Here's a bit of detail around the syllabus content. So it'll be looking at aspects of grammar, lexis, so the breakdown of words, what part of speech they are, word formulation with prefixes, suffixes, synonyms, antonyms, and stuff like that. Aspects of phonology, the phonemic alphabet, words and sentence stress, functions, functions of language, levels of formality and appropriacy, for example, and also language skills, listening, reading, speaking and writing, and the features of different types of texts. And these are just some of the examples. It's not an exhaustive list. And the second area of module 1 is the background to language learning. And here's an example of the testing focus. So in the syllabus, motivation, so what motivates learners and the importance of it, exposure to language and focus on form. So this is related to sort of L2 acquisition theories, the role of error in language learning, whether it be errors and slips and at what stage they occur in the development stage, the differences between L2 and L1 learning, learner characteristics, so learning preferences, past language learning experiences, and the needs of learners. And then the final aspect is the background to language teaching. So looking at presentation techniques and introductory activities, types of activities and tasks for language and skills development, and assessment types and tasks. Okay, well, here's an example of a multiple matching task from the test. Hopefully you can see that, and I was going to ask if you could have a go at doing the task. So you need to match the questions 1 to 7 with the descriptions for listening skills listed in A to D, and decide on the correct answers. So for example, A could apply to listening for GIS, could apply to, say, for example, answers 4 and 7. Listening B could apply to answer 3, for example. Those aren't the correct answers necessarily, but I wondered if you could have a go at the task and write some of your answers in the chat. Give you a couple or 3 minutes to have a go at the task.
Hugh, can you hear us?
Hello. Did you get some of the answers right? So number 1, identifying opinions on the topic of the conversation. That was listening for gist. That was understanding attitude. I beg your pardon. Number 2, was listening for gist. Number 3, using clues from what's heard to guess what follows was C, predicting. Number 4, identifying a particular word, name, date, or expression was listening for specific information, B. Number 5, that was identifying how many speakers there are, that was listening for gist. Number 6, using clues in stress and intonation to identify what a speaker thinks, that was understanding attitude, D. And using knowledge of a particular topic to understand how a conversation might develop was predicting, that's answer C. So hopefully gives you a flavour of one of the tasks. And now let's have a look at the second of the TKT modules, that's module 2. It's the same format as timing as module 1, but focuses on what teachers consider and do while planning and preparing a lesson or a sequence of lessons. It also considers the selection and use of resources, including course books, supplementary materials and activities, teaching aids, and what assessment methods to use. And here's an example of one of the TKT questions. So you have to match the classroom activity with the main teaching aim. So this is multiple choice, A, B, or C. And again, see if you can get the correct answer to this question. So after a group work discussion activities, learners work with a partner from another group to share information. A, to vary the interaction pattern. B, to give restrictive practice of targeted language. Or C, to focus attention on learning strategies. Any ideas for the answers? In fact, somebody got it right in the chat, so indeed it was answer A. So moving on to the last of the core modules, module 3, managing and teaching the learning process. It's the same format again and tests teachers' knowledge of what happens in the classroom in terms of language used by the teachers or learners, the roles the teacher can fulfill, and the ways in which the teacher can manage and exploit classroom events and interactions. And I'll show another example of the task here. So again, multiple choice, looking at classroom management terms and 3 possible descriptions, A, B, or C. And you have to decide which answer describes interaction patterns and rapport in the next question. And the first one should be very easy for you after looking at the module 2 question. So let's see if you've got any answers in the chat. So in fact, the answer to question 48 is A, and the answer to rapport, that is the relationship between teachers and learners, that is answer B. Looking at the first of the specialist modules, that's young learners. It's an exam for teachers and classroom assistants who want to teach English to young learners. And it tests knowledge of concepts related to young learners' learning and development, and knowledge of young learners from a teaching perspective, including the planning, teaching and assessment of young learners' work. And here's a couple of the types of questions that you would get. See how you get on with those. So it asks you to look at the statements about using additional resources and choose the option which completes each statement. So word puzzles can be a useful way of A, practicing reading comprehension, B, improving learners' word stress, or C, reviewing a lexical set. And the next question, I find computer games where children put sentences in the right order to make a story can be useful because children get A, immediate feedback on their answers, B, the chance to invent interesting stories, or C, plenty of listening practice. Let's see if you've got some answers. So, oh yes, that's looking good. Yeah, so plenty of right answers for question 28, which is C. And 29, we're getting the answers in there. Well, actually, quite a few people put B for question 29, but the answer should be A to get immediate feedback. So generally speaking, with computer games, you get some instant feedback. But I can understand why you might have put B. The other specialist module is TKT CLIL. That's content and learning and language integrated learning. And this module tests knowledge of the aims and rationale of a CLIL approach, and it covers the planning, teaching and assessment of CLIL. And it also focuses on teachers' awareness of learning demands and support strategies for learners in CLIL programs. And I haven't got an example of a question for this one because I thought by this time you might feel like you've sat an exam yourselves. So in terms of the reporting of results, as I mentioned before, there's a certificate issued for each module that's completed. There's no pass or fail, but results are reported against 4 band descriptors, which is shown here. So even if a test taker doesn't know a lot, they will at least get a certificate. But obviously, if they get a band 1, it kind of indicates that at this stage in their learning, they don't know too much about teaching knowledge. But with a band 4, as the descriptor says, demonstrates they have extensive knowledge of TKT content areas. More details of the tests can be found in the TKT handbooks for teachers, and the 3 for the TKT modules 1 to 3, young learners and CLIL, can be found at the address shown here on our public website, and you can download the 3 PDFs as a bundle, as it were. So a lot of information in the handbooks, which goes into more detail than I've done so far. Now I'm going to show you a quick video of a teacher in China who took TKT before I go on to talk about the impact study in Mexico. And I thought that it would give me an opportunity to have a quick drink of water and for you to have a break from my voice. She talks about teachers in China, but I think what she says is equally applicable to teachers in any part of the world. So hopefully you can hear this. Okay. So now for the final part of my presentation, I'll now go on to look at a research study which Cambridge English undertook to understand the effects and consequences of using TKT within the Mexican.
Hugh. Sorry, Hugh, can I just interrupt? Apologies, Hugh, it's me, Vicky. We didn't get any sound on the video, unfortunately. Do you want to try that one again?
Yes, of course. Yes, sorry about that. Let me try.
I just thought it was about to come and I wasn't one. Let's see. No, we still can't hear anything.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
Perhaps the settings, if you want to fiddle a bit with the settings. Try again.
Shall I try again?
Try again. If not, then perhaps we might have to.
Yeah, might have to
online
give
conference
it a miss for now. Sorry about that. Let me try once more.
Once more. No.
No. Oh, I'm very sorry. Yes. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Should have done a sound check before, maybe. Apologies.
No problem.
So, like I said, I'm going on to talk about the case study into the impact of TKT within the Mexican education context. Well, as you'd expect from a part of Cambridge University, Cambridge English has considerable expertise in designing effective impact studies and considers monitoring and evaluation as a key element of English language improvement initiatives as a means of gathering evidence to consider their success and to guide future policy decisions. The approach which I'll now describe has been tried and tested in many contexts in the impact studies we've done around the world. And in the case of Mexico, it started off by determining the rationale for the study. And then next, we agreed on the research methods to be used, and then decided who were the key stakeholders to involve in the study. And then we went on to agree the research questions we wanted to ask. And we decided to use what's called a mixed methods approach to gather quantitative and qualitative data via means of interviews, surveys, and questionnaires. And then we took the combined data from the qualitative and quantitative data studies, and we analysed, collated and interpreted that data to produce a set of findings which were put into a detailed report. And then we disseminated the report via various means, including our research notes, and that was research notes 58, and I can give you a link to that in a short while. Looking at the stakeholder analysis, we did this to ensure that we targeted the right people and that the views being expressed were representative and valid. And in total, 660 stakeholders were involved in the study, so quite a large number from across 31 Mexican states, and they provided their views on the impact of TKT in Mexico. And the first of the group represented policymakers, planners and implementers, including government officials, representatives from the higher education sector, as well as private teacher training institutes. And they comprised 27 participants from 17 states. Sorry, just check. And the second group of research participants were 633 teachers who'd taken TKT in the year leading up to the study. And most of the participants or the respondents, 71% were female. And these teachers came from a range of educational settings, including state and private primary and secondary schools, language institutes, and higher education institutes like universities. And the participants were asked to provide ratings on a Likert scale to around 60 questions, which were administered in the form of an online questionnaire. And we grouped the questions under various headings. That's professional development statements, impact on knowledge of pedagogy, impact on teaching practice, and general impact. And here are some here are some examples of a couple of questions. Whoops, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. From the personal development category. So as I said, it was a Likert scale where they had to say if they agreed strongly or disagreed with the statements, and there were more than this. This is just a couple of the questions that we posed to them. And then looking at the responses from the stakeholders, in this case, group 1. So these were the 27 interviews conducted with policymakers, planners and implementers. They said that generally TKT was a useful way of improving the quality of teaching and the ability level of the teaching staff, which had a positive impact on the reputation of the institution and the ability to deliver their education reform aims. And expectations were met, improvement in terms of improvement to teaching practices and students' language proficiency, with an improved ability to measure the teacher's existing knowledge and skills as a result of adopting TKT. However, some of the expectations of the group were not met, especially when teachers had not taken TKT, either because there'd been insufficient funding or a lack of interest. But looking at a quote from the state coordinator in one of the districts in Mexico, he said that we consider TKT to be a fundamental tool to certify that the teacher has the essential teaching skills to teach a second language. So that was a positive outcome. And now looking at the responses from the teachers, that was the 633 teachers. This is a sample of some of the answers related to the professional development statements where we've put the percentage figures. So you can see very high numbers of teachers either strongly agreed or agreed with the statements. 92% saying they had a better understanding of the theoretical principles underlying their teaching. 91% they developed a better understanding of the communicative approaches in English language teaching. And 86% thought that this has been beneficial for their professional career in Mexico. So some very strong agreement between the 633 teachers. And looking at the statements relating to personal development, again, some very high figures for strongly agreeing or agreeing. So 93% said they felt more motivated to continue developing as a professional teacher. Also 93% thought that they'd got greater self-awareness of the positive aspects of their teaching. And 89% they felt more confident about their teaching skills. So this is really positive. And although we didn't interview their students, it's generally the case that once the teacher improves their application of their teaching knowledge in the classroom, the response from the students is really positive because they feel that they're learning more, which in turn boosts the teacher morale, as you can imagine. So this was really an interesting study. So overall, the results show that individual teachers viewed TKT primarily as a personal and professional development opportunity. And there was also strong evidence that TKT increased teachers' confidence and strengthened their commitment to the teaching profession by encouraging the view that teaching was a rewarding career. On the other hand, institutions, that was stakeholder group 1, the policymakers and the implementers, saw TKT as a way of improving the quality of teaching and the caliber of teaching staff. So it's definitely interesting to get the perspectives from both groups. So in conclusion, impact studies of this time can help evaluate the success or benefits of initiatives. And we're here at Cambridge to help design and implement this type of research. And if you want to learn more about this particular study, you can visit the Cambridge English website and access our research notes. This is research notes 58. And here is the URL where you can download a PDF and find out about this study and others within this issue. And we've got more recent research notes published too. Well, just want to wrap up my talk now by saying a little bit about TKT challenges. So obviously, in a world that doesn't stop still, there are some challenges for TKT. So it's always going to be the case that teaching is context-based and different aspects cannot always be taken into account with a standardized test format. So there's cultural aspects to teaching as we can imagine, and traditional ways of doing things which not everybody adopts. For example, the communicative approach to teaching, which is the one which underpins the concept and the design of this test. And especially with the pandemic, this has brought about changes to the way teaching is carried out. And this can impact on the relevance of test content So disruption has led to, as we know, more online learning, and it takes sometimes time to update content to reflect those changes. Also, in terms of relevance, English is not the only medium of instruction, and in an increasingly multilingual society, or societies, I should say. And we also realize that having a paper-based version of the test is not necessarily ideal, because during the pandemic, there were disruptions to that content. So ideally, we would produce a computer-based version of the test. So to meet these challenges, we will continue to review the test content and its performance, and consider alternative delivery modes. So I think we've got some minutes for any questions that you might have. I don't know if you want to then put the questions in the chat and see if I can answer them for you. I don't know if it should be the questions and answers section actually, as opposed to the chat.
Hugh, I think there's some questions in both. If you wish, I could read the questions and answer from the questions from the question and answer section, if you wish.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm really sorry at the moment. It's the so I'll just try putting the volume up. It's quite quiet, I must say. Just a second, please.
No problem.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Can I just go straight to a question that has been sent in? And the question is there a mock test for TKT? And to be able to take it before taking the real test?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question, actually. Well, we do have example of practice tests on the public website. So if you go to the Cambridge Assessment English website, you can see that, those examples. So there's a section on the public website which is for teachers, and then you'll see the teaching knowledge test. So you can download those papers. But also I mentioned pre-testing. So not all exam centres around the world are involved in pre-testing, but where they are, that also provides an opportunity for teachers to get a very realistic experience of taking TKT.
Actually, a related question is.
Oh, I should say that there's also practice tests within the TKT handbooks. Yeah.
And a sort of related question, someone's written in about how many people actually participate in the testing of new tests, so in the pre-trialing and the pre-testing stage.
We always try and get hundreds of candidates from a representative sample around the world to participate in the trialing of test items. Yeah, I mean, there's a minimum number, but we don't need thousands, but hundreds is something that we aim for.
Lovely. And a question around the recognition. Could you talk about the recognition of TKT?
I did. So, as I said, I mean, it is widely recognized around the world by different organizations. It's difficult to summarize, really, but so, be it ministries of education, be it higher education institutes, and the best way to look at the recognition for the test again is to go onto our public website. Maybe it would have been an idea to try and share that. So we have a recognition section, and then you can look for TKT within your particular country. So for example, if you want to see within the United Kingdom, it shows all those organizations that recognize TKT. Or for example, if you were living in Spain, or if you're wanting to migrate somewhere, you can see which organizations recognize TKT in a particular country via the public website.
Lovely. And there's one question here around how many correct answers would be necessary to achieve, obviously, a good passing. Is there information around the scoring and how it's scored?
No, there isn't. I mean, it's not the case that it's like 50%, for a band 2 or 60% correct answers out of 80 for a band 3. We don't have that information. I mean, to a certain extent, it does vary slightly from test to test, because I mentioned about the item bank and the different test attributes, and when we pre-test we get statistics, so there's a slight difference. We try and construct the tests all to the same overall level of difficulty, but there's slight differences, so can vary very slightly between different tests. So it is a bit dependent on that, but we don't have information about the number of correct answers you need to get a band 1, a band 2, a band 3, or band 4.
Sure. And an interesting question here is about how it could be used within perhaps a preset or teacher training, teacher education. The question I have here from an attendee is about, do you believe it is appropriate to include it in a compulsory manner in preset training? Or how do you see it being used in preset? Or do you see it being used in service training? What's your view?
Both. So it's entirely suitable for both, because as I showed in that diagram, it sort of goes from the foundation to the developing stages. So teachers with, I mean, you know, ideally with some knowledge. I mean, if they're starting out at the very beginning of their course, it wouldn't be appropriate, because, you know, it's going to be difficult to test if they really haven't built up much knowledge on their preset training. But once they've done that, maybe at the end of, you know, a year or 2 of their studies, it will be appropriate, but not really at the beginning. Whereas for teachers, obviously, one assumes that they will have built up some knowledge because they're already practicing. So it's definitely appropriate for them. So both contexts, but you would want the preset teachers to build up some experience, at least some knowledge of their teaching before they attempted to do TKT.
Wonderful. And just another question has popped up. The question is, what level is TKT? I'm going to assume it's either or both the language proficiency level it's aimed at, and also perhaps the teacher methodology level it may be aimed at. So
yeah, so in terms of the language level, we do suggest at least a B1, a CFR B1 level. Otherwise, it's going to be possibly quite difficult to understand the questions. But and they are written in such a way that they will be accessible to people with that level of language. In terms of the knowledge, well, I would refer people back to the Cambridge English Teaching Framework, where you can see the descriptors for the different competencies on the framework for the foundation and developing stages, which will give a better indication of the knowledge that you need.
Practical one has come in around how many times the test is administered. Is there a schedule for this test, or can it be taken on demand? And a second part to that question is, how long does it take to get the results back? Do you know?
Okay, it is an on-demand test. So in theory, you know, it can be taken at any time, any day. The issue there would be that it would depend on the individual Cambridge approved exam centre where it's been taken. So although we say it's on demand, the centre might make their own choices about when they offer the test. So you'd need to approach the individual centre to find out when they intend to run TKT. And they might say, well, you know, we're not going to run it if we've only got 1 or 2 candidates interested at this point. The results we issue within after 2 weeks, or 2 weeks after we've received the answers back from the centres. So once we've got the answer sheets back, we process the results in 2 weeks.
Lovely. And I see that your colleague Stephen King has posted the links concerning both the recognition and also more information about the test.
Yes.
I think we've come to the close of your workshop. If there's any closing statement you'd like to make, Hugh, before we close officially?
No, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and please do look at this link on the website, which maybe is the same one that Steve has put up in the chat, and access more information about TKT. And yeah, and you know, if you've got any questions, then you know, further questions, I think you've got Steve's email address, or I'd certainly be very pleased to share mine too.
And may I say also thank you to yourself, Hugh, and also to your colleague, Steve. It's very good. And we're very happy to have our partners and friends, Cambridge, join us and share your expertise in assessment.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much to everyone who's been listening. Thank you very much for your active participation and your interesting comments. And there's a lot of thank yous and very relevant comments to you, Hugh. So once again, have a wonderful evening in Uzbekistan. I'm just about to have my afternoon, same as Hugh and Steve, no doubt. And hopefully we'll see everyone tomorrow for the final day, unfortunately, but we have a great program. Please join us tomorrow at, I think it's 2 p.m. Yes, 2 p.m. Uzbekistan time, 9 a.m. UK time for day 3 of the conference tomorrow. We look forward to seeing everyone. And thanks again, Hugh.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.